Hello, welcome back to my channel, Anglican Aesthetics. In this video, I want to run a thought experiment, and it's not a pleasant thought experiment, so do be advised. This is I think, a pretty scary thought experiment, and I call it Bob the Baby Killer, how to be consistently pro-choice. The idea here is that I will play the role of someone named Bob, and his profession involves killing babies and killing them painlessly. And I will argue that any other reason for the pro-choice position, other than the fetus isn't a human person, is a really bad reason to be pro-choice. If you think Bob's reasoning is bad in these cases, owing to the personhood of the baby, then that should be the relevant consideration in this discussion. So when I say how to be consistently pro-choice, I mean how to be consistently pro-choice if you think the personhood of the fetus isn't relevant. So let's begin. Hello, I'm Bob. I live in the country of Akarema, and I euthanize babies for a living. These are babies most people don't want. And I use the kind of pro-choice reasoning that I see a lot of people in America use to justify my profession. Now, please don't get me wrong. When I kill babies, euthanize them, or kill them through other means, it's always actually painless. We've perfected the method so that it's painless, it's instant, it's quick. They don't feel a thing. So I want to give a few glimpses of the kinds of scenarios I routinely deal with. In the first scenario, mothers give birth and they decide they don't want the baby. Now, you have to feel her pain in this instance. The baby will be born into vast poverty. So our solution to save the baby from suffering is painless euthanasia. We just euthanize the baby. Sometimes we put them under and crush their heads instantly, and they don't feel a thing because it happens instantly. And we use either method depending on which one is most cost effective at the time, which one preserves the most resources for society as a whole. Now, if you think that I'm doing something evil, isn't it better for us just to kill the baby rather than to have them live a life of poverty? And if you'd force the baby to live a life of poverty, isn't it you who's pro-suffering? Isn't it better for us just to kill the baby if the mother doesn't want to go through the process of putting the child up for adoption? Unfortunately, even in our country, like in the country of America, putting your child up for adoption is a grueling process. It can be very extensive, and often mothers just don't want to do that. And sometimes mothers give birth, and then they see their baby, and they decide that actually they don't want to raise this child. They decide there where they thought they did, but they actually don't. So, isn't it better for us to just kill this baby? And again, it's painless, it's instant. So what's the problem? Now, some people might say, well, the difference between a fetus and a baby is that a baby can feel pain. Well, they can't at the moment of their deaths, just like fetuses can't at the moment of abortion. We euthanize them and or instantly crush their heads after having put them under. So they don't. They are incapable of feeling pain at that moment. Now, if you want to say, well, they have the capacity to feel pain in general, well, then so does a fetus by that reasoning. Because a fetus will develop that capacity after the relevant moments of time pass. Now, perhaps one might want to say, well, babies are independent of their mother's body, and so do have a right to be cared for by their mother. But why does bodily autonomy stop in utero? Do you seriously think a baby is independent of his or her mother's body? Have you ever been woken up by a screaming newborn? Do you have any idea of what that does to the body long term? Being woken up in the middle of the night for feedings has a demonstrable effect on the resources of a woman's body, and of a father's body as well, if the father is involved. So why does bodily autonomy stop there? Now, one might say, well, babies can, at the point of birth, be given up for adoption. Well, so what? So what? Does that matter at all? Fetuses can, at the point of birth, be given up for adoption too. So what if a mother just doesn't want to go through all that trouble of giving the baby up for adoption in the same way that a mother might not want to carry a fetus to term for that same reason? What's wrong with that reasoning? Well, here's another kind of scenario in my line of work. Upon birth, we find out sometimes that the baby has a birth defect. For whatever reason, sometimes it goes undetected in utero. So, when we find this out, we just euthanize the baby and or painlessly crush its body, again, depending on which is a cheaper and more effective method. Now, if you can terminate a fetus for birth defects in the womb, well, why can't you do the same with babies? It would spare the baby a difficult life. In the same way that killing a fetus in the womb, aborting a fetus, spares the fetus of a difficult life. Well, and if you're saying, well, because it's a baby, we don't have a right to take away that baby's life, well, then you're not really for the baby's life. You're just pro-suffering. You just want the baby to suffer long term because of your moral high ground. Now, let's raise another scenario. A mother gives birth, but then decides that the baby reminds her too much of her rapist. There's a typo there. Reminds her of her rapist. No, there's not. So, we kill the baby. We euthanize them painlessly and or crush them instantly. Now, if this is a valid reason to kill fetuses, why can't we kill babies at this stage of birth? Well, some might say, well, when you give birth to the baby, you can give the baby away. But that's true of a fetus as well, of carrying the fetus to term. And plus, let's just say the mere existence of the baby causes its mother pain. She knows that her rapist baby is out there. And one day, maybe that baby will contact her. And she doesn't want that. So, why can't we kill it for that reason? I think, in my line of work, that if you think that it is right to kill a fetus, even if the fetus is a human person, for considerations of bodily autonomy or these other kinds of considerations, say sparing the fetus of poverty, sparing them of pain, whatever it might be, well, then you should be completely okay with my profession. Okay, so Bob is clearly sadistic and cruel. So end of thought experiment. And if you think Bob is sadistic and cruel, you should be pro-life. At least at minimum, if you're not pro-life, you should at least recognize that the issue does in fact center around the personhood of the fetus. If you think his reasoning from bodily autonomy or other considerations don't apply in the case of the baby, why would they apply in a case of the fetus? And again, Bob addressed that objection that, well, the fetus is directly sort of hooked up to the mother's body, using the mother's resources against the mother's will. Well, there are two things to say there. First of all, most babies, even most abortions, are committed in the wake of free consensual sex. And to say, I've heard so many people say this, that when one consents to sex, they're not consenting to pregnancy. That's absurd. That's patently absurd moral reasoning. And we know that. If you play baseball in a park and you hit the ball and it flies through someone's window, you're liable. And you can't say, well, I didn't consent to the ball flying through someone's window, so I'm not really responsible for that happening. No, there was a reasonable risk that you could ascertain latent within the activity itself that could lead to that consequence. If you think someone is responsible for the direct consequences of their actions, then it's absurd to say someone wouldn't be responsible for a pregnancy that results from a free consensual act of sex. Now, you can only apply these types of reasoning, I'm arguing if and only if the fetus isn't a human person. And that's why the discussion has to rigorously remain over whether the fetus is a human person. All of these other considerations are smokescreens. If even the consideration of rape, Bob, for example, pointed out that, well, sometimes a mother gives birth and then decides that the baby reminds her too much of her rapist, right? And she didn't consent to the baby's coming into the world. Now, one might say, well, the baby is born at that moment, and so she can't impose her will on this other living person. But that's precisely the problem, right? We're contending that the fetus is a human person. And if you're saying, well, she can't impose her will on an independent person. Well, frankly, babies just aren't independent persons. They can't survive on their own. They do use the resources of other people's bodies to survive in the first few years of their life. There's no such thing as a baby that raises itself. And so dependency can't have anything to do, even dependency on other people's bodies can't have anything to do over whether a person is a person and has moral status, has rights. So again, we have to keep the discussion over whether the fetus is or isn't a human person. If Bob is sadistic and cruel, then you should concede that point. And we should drop these discussions of bodily autonomy that are actually irrelevant to the issue of abortion